Josiah Mwangi Kariuki was an MP who disappeared in mysterious circumstances in 1975. His widow, Terry Wanjiru Kariuki, remembers how she found herself in a Nairobi morgue, looking at his dead body one Tuesday afternoon in March that year. His face looked very dark, as if something had been poured on it, she says. But it was the tag attached to his foot with the word unknown that really sticks in her mind. Here is your husband, lying dead on the table. And somebody says he's unknown. That's what really tore my heart out, she told the BBC's Witness programme. Known as JM, her husband had gone missing from their home the previous week. An ambitious and popular politician, he had spent time in prison as a member of the Mau Mau, the group that had fought for Kenya's independence in 1963. Recently elected to the Kenyan parliament, he now had his eyes on the presidency. On paper, he looked destined for success. He was a member of the influential Kikuyu ethnic group, and as a former private secretary to the aging president Jomo Kenyatta, he was part of the government's inner circle. But in mid-1970s, Kenya, dissent was not tolerated. Mr. Kariuki had rallied against corruption, which he said was widespread, fought for land distribution that favored the poor, and argued that Kenya had become a nation of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. Journalist and historian Martin Meredith, who covered J.M. Kariuki's murder for the Sunday Times in 1975, has described him as a playboy, not a particularly admirable character, but gifted with an unerring popular touch. His criticism of government policy did not earn him any favors with Kenyatta's group and made him some powerful enemies. Speaking from the house she once shared with her husband and their children outside the capital, Nairobi, Terry Kariuki says he had already received threats to his life before he went missing. He knew people were after him, and once or twice his car was shot at, she says. I guess he was too confident. He had bodyguards but didn't use them. We begged him to be careful and leave the country, but he would say, "Who would want to hurt me?" On 1st March, Mrs. Kariuki took her husband to the doctor about a pain in his knee. Then they went their separate ways, and when she returned the following day, he was not at home. Before disappearing, Mr. Kariuki had left a message with staff, saying he was off to meet Mr. Ben Gethi, a senior intelligence officer who had called in on him that morning. When he had still not returned the next day, Mrs. Kariuki, his third wife, alerted the family and search parties were sent out. After heated questions in Parliament, the government announced that Mr. Kariuki was in Zambia. This baffled the family as his passport was still at home, and a friend and minister in the Zambian government said he had not seen him. We started to think something terrible must have happened to him, says Mrs. Kariuki. According to multiple news articles and news agencies, J.M. Kariuki's fate was sealed when he was called to meet senior intelligence officers at Kingsway House in Nairobi. Gethi and J.M. would enter the building through a back entrance and would head for the office of a senior officer. In the room, there was a senior officer, J.M., Kenyatta's security chief Wanyoike Tungu, the head of the NYS Mr. Itot, CID director Mr. Nderi, and reservist Mr. Patrick Shaw. J.M. was apprehensive to see Mr. Thungu in the meeting. The two had never had time for each other ever since J.M. worked as Kenyatta's private secretary in the early 1960s. He also knew of Mr. Wanyoike's roles in the Nakuru meetings, which plotted against him. At Kingsway House, Mr. Gethi would leave J.M. to be questioned, as he would indicate during a parliamentary probe by Mr. Nderi and Mr. Shaw on the bombings. It had been alleged that he was liable. Mr. J.M. would convince the sitting allegations raised by Mr. Nderi and Mr. Shaw. Until there was benefit of doubt, he had had nothing to do with the bombings. Mr. Thungu, who remained silent during the interrogation, would take over the questioning, inquiring why J.M. had been going around the country insulting President Jomo Kenyatta. J.M. would deny that he had ever insulted President Kenyatta and that all he had talked about was social justice for all Kenyans, which was quite in line with Kenyatta's beliefs. The exchange between J.M. and Mr. Thungu became heated. Mr. Thungu would lose his temper and would punch J.M. viciously in the mouth, knocking out 3 of his teeth. J.M.'s body was found at the city mortuary 8 days later with 3 lower teeth missing. Instinctively, the bleeding from his mouth would have caused JM to reach for a pistol in his pocket, the same gun he had been given by Mr. Gethy that morning. However, Gethy, the only person in the room who knew JM had a gun, was quicker on the draw. He whipped out his service revolver and shot JM in the upper right-hand arm to protect Mr. Thungu. As JM collapsed in a pool of blood, Mr. Thungu phoned a senior politician to inform them of what had happened. It is not known what the senior politician said. However, evidence received by the JM Probe Committee and later corroborated by Mr. Gethy in a confession to JM's sister many years later stated that after the telephone call, Mr. Thungu called 3 men who had been waiting in another room. He ordered them to handcuff JM and take him to a car downstairs. The vehicle into which a bleeding and wailing JM was bundled into was a green Peugeot station wagon with a red inscription, Meat Park, which was used to supply meat. It belonged to a councillor in Ngong Ward, the area in which JM's bullet-ridden body was discovered by 2 Maasai elders the following morning. Finally, the news Mrs. Kariuki had been dreading came. A journalist told her that he had received reports that JM had been assassinated. She hurried to Nairobi's city mortuary and managed to convince the manager to let her in. She didn't have to search for long before she found her husband's body, fully clothed, lying on a table. I recognized his olive green jacket and a scarf that I knew, says Mrs. Kariuki. He hadn't been placed in a cold room in one of those boxes. Something was going on. She didn't know who she could trust, so she concealed her emotions at the morgue and pretended that the body wasn't her husband's. However, when the family received the dreadful news, they stormed the parliament at around 1830, when many MPs were still present. You can imagine the commotion. We were a convoy of angry people. When we arrived, we found a senior minister having coffee. I poured the coffee over his head because I was so angry. Everyone was screaming, "You have killed JM. JM is dead," Mrs. Kariuki narrates. Together with some MPs, the family would rush back to the nearby morgue, which was now surrounded by heavily armed police officers. As they went around the side of the building, they saw workers trying to push JM's body out through a window. It was like a horror movie. Another 10 minutes and the body would have been gone. People would have told me I was crazy, Mrs. Kariuki narrates. On 12th of March, a police commissioner finally confirmed that Mr. Kariuki was dead, killed by 2 bullet wounds. At the post-mortem, Mrs. Kariuki later discovered that the discoloration on her husband's face may have been caused by acid poured on to prevent identification of the body. In Nairobi, students vented their anger on the streets and newspapers ran headlines saying Kenya's stability was at risk. This was the 3rd murder of an outspoken politician in 10 years. The government would set up a commission of inquiry. But before it was published, President Kenyatta demanded the removal of certain names close to him. 40 years on, the murder is still unsolved, though his widow remains convinced it was a political assassination. When you put 2 and 2 together, you know who killed JM. People around the president were very jealous of him and saw him as the only stumbling block for those who were vying for the presidency after Kenyatta. J.M. Kariuki remains a contradiction of sorts. He was certainly flamboyant, a ladies' man with several wives who liked the races. He was a millionaire and a capitalist himself, but he still talked about things that resonated with the common man, he says. He is remembered as one of a few courageous men who stood up to Kenyatta.